Hi, I'm Amy Smith-Stewart. I'm Chief Curator at the Aldrich. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm actually standing in for my colleague, Namilin, who's our Director of Education, who coordinated this event and couldn't be here tonight. But I co-organized the Raven Halfmoon exhibition with the Chief Curator, Rachel Adams, who's at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts. And actually, Raven's show is closing at the Aldrich on January 7th, and then traveling to the Bemis where it will open there in May. And we're hoping actually it will keep on going. The tour will continue. And I'm really excited tonight to have Laura Phipps with us, who's the Associate Curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And since 2009, she's organized projects such as Jaune Quick-to-See Smith, Memory Map, Around Day's End, Downtown New York City, 1970 to 1985, Virginia Overton, Sculpture Gardens, Open Plan, Andrea Fraser, and Flatlands, a group show of emerging artists. Laura is also co-chair of the Whitney's Indigenous Artists and Audiences Working Group, leading institutional engagement and collaboration with Indigenous artists. Prior to the Whitney, Phipps worked in the curatorial department and director's office of the Modern Art Museum in Fort Worth. She received her MA in art history at Hunter College and BFA in studio art and BS in psychology from Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. I also want to say that the Aldrich is located on the ancestral homelands of the Wappinger, Munsee, and Lenape peoples, a place known as Ridgefield, Connecticut today. And the Aldrich is a non-collecting institution, and we present exhibitions by emerging artists, established artists, and thematic group exhibitions throughout the year. This talk was organized because we're hosting the Raven Halfmoon exhibition tonight, and Laura's going to be speaking about Raven's work, but also about other contemporary artists who work with large-scale ceramics. So please join me in welcoming Laura tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Laura.
you. I'll press you. Thank you so much, Amy. It was a very nice introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm super honored that Raven asked me to engage with her work. I've been following her work for a little while now. We also share a background in Oklahoma, so I think she thought that I would, have something to say about her work, but I am not going to talk about being from Oklahoma. Instead, I'm going to talk about, a lot of different things that I've been sort of thinking about. I really actually want to thank you all for being my sort of unwitting partners in some ideas. I'm going to maybe just throw some stuff out there and see what sticks, and really scratch just the surface of some topics that others have definitely spent a lot of time thinking about, really deeply about, and also give a tease of some artist practice that perhaps some of you all already are familiar with or will want to know more deeply, hopefully. So we're here on the occasion of Raven Halfmoon's brilliant solo show, Flags of Our Mothers. And so taking Halfmoon's work and really the entirety of her practice as a jumping off point. And while the bulk of Halfmoon's practice is identified around ceramics, it's not solely that, as you can see in other examples, just in this show alone. That's really what we're going to look at. And I want to think about some important aspects of her use of ceramics in order to talk more broadly about connections through some other contemporary ceramic practices. And there are sort of two modes of connection I was thinking about or wanted to highlight. And one is the cultural and historic connection, and another is a collaborative and community connection of ceramics work. So sort of just to start to think about, why it is that artists or anyone works with or has a relationship with clay, I really liked this quote that the curator and scholar Jamie Powell wrote in a book about contemporary native ceramics. She says, nearly all of us have experienced what it feels like to create forms with clay. Through this practice, this action, we are subliminally reminded of our inherent connection to place and our relationships to one another. This is the power of clay. So to look more at the power of clay, and particularly to these connections, historical and cultural, and collaborative and community, I'm going to look at Raven's work, as well as a few other artists engaged in contemporary ceramic practices and in social practice and collaboration. So some of the artists that we're going to talk about, I know that Raven has mentioned as influences, others as collaborators. I'm going to talk about Simone Leigh and Theaster and Rose B. Simpson and Cannupa Hanska Luger. One of the most important aspects of Halfmoon's practice is her own identity as an Indigenous woman, specifically as a Caddo woman, and this identity is really the place where her understanding of art and of language and material is located. So it can't really be minimized in the understanding of her work, but not all the artists that we're going to talk about sort of share the same backgrounds. But the way I sort of see it, they do share one set of values, and that is really the strong interest in destabilizing classifications of ceramics specifically, and more broadly of historic practices. So we'll look at the way that these artists are studying and using historic practices, the way that the practices they're using have been classified as ancient, or the products that came out of them have been classified as ethnographic or objects of ethnographic study. And these artists are also doing work that's been classified as craft, a term outside of fine art, and thinking about the way these artists are approaching history and the history of material culture, specifically as processes for future building. So when I talk about sort of the historical and cultural connection that's really paramount in these artist ceramics practices, I'm starting with an understanding that there is knowledge embedded in clay as a material of the earth, that there's a history in the material itself and in its composition, and that there are also histories in the passing down of knowledge in the making of pottery. You can imagine what other knowledge is passed alongside learning these technical skills. So we'll look sort of briefly at what that means for these artists. But also the economic commodity that's in the history of ceramics, a tool of local entrepreneurship, particularly for women, a tool of empowerment or simply survival. And I think that I mentioned this briefly, and I'll keep saying it over and over again, but one of the most interesting aspects of, I think, all of these artists' work, and specifically their research into histories of craft and of ceramics, is that they're thinking about the potential of this material for the future. How does the understanding of our past inform all of the futures that we can imagine? And I think this feels particularly important as we're talking about this particular group of artists that are working in a practice that has been marginalized, both in the field and the economies of fine art, and also has been practiced by artists in communities that have been marginalized. So the history and culture is one part of it, and then I'm also really interested in the collaborative and community connection that I think there are many ways to think about it, the ways that they're approaching this. And I think one big one, and just sort of being in this space and seeing these giant works, is that there's something just manifest in the technical production of ceramic work, period, but really large-scale sculpture that cannot be made with one set of hands. So collaboration is really inherent in much of the work, starting from that process of passing down knowledge, but also into the physical and sort of technical way that things are made. And collaboration into community, or bringing community into collaborate, is another way that artists are thinking about this work. It requires real thought and real care, and I think that's a mode that these artists are all working in. So those are the ways we're going to talk about these artist practices. Raven. Everyone, if you haven't seen the whole show, you're seeing most of it here big. I'm so excited to be standing, even though I feel very small. And I think what's really on display is the way that Raven is just flexing her practice. It's not just that they're so large, but that they're so physical, and it really gets at what is important about the work and the physicality. So I want to jump right into, there we are, one of the most important influences for Halfmoon, which is the artist Jerry Redcorn, who is an artist that's credited, a Caddo woman who's credited with single-handedly reviving the artistic tradition of Caddo ceramics. Caddo's pottery traditions had actually faded away in the 1800s, but in 1991, Redcorn, who was did not really consider herself necessarily an artist at the time, was involved in efforts to preserve Caddo songs and dances, but when she went with a group to the Museum of the Red River in Idabel, Oklahoma, she encountered Caddo pots for the first time, and she really started focusing her energy there. She was taken with the intricate designs, the really graceful shapes, and so she began her research into restoring this really labor-intensive process. So Caddo, the process for making Caddo pots is they're hand-formed with coils of clay. They're engraved with hand tools as well, many of which still exist, and then are burnished with smooth stones, and finally they're wood fired, often in pits. And Halfmoon talks about the importance of learning directly from Redcorn in her youth and being able to return to Redcorn's lessons throughout her own learning process. But Halfmoon also studied anthropology at the University of Arkansas, and there she really learned more about ancient Caddo pottery, that there are hundreds of types of typologies of specific Caddo vessels. Matriarchs of the clans determined the pottery type for a family that sort of continued throughout generations. And I think it's interesting to note that Caddo vessels, historic Caddo vessels, can be found in collections all over the world, which really points to their important economic and cultural role in trade. And Caddo takes a lot of what she learned from Redcorn and others. There are a few others that have sort of picked up the lessons and carry on the tradition. And Raven also works in these traditional Caddo processes and thinks about how the ancient processes that have been sort of relearned, reinvigorated, live on today, how these lessons of the past can live in the present, and then what they might mean for the future. So obviously Raven's not making graceful pots or incising them in these really sort of delicate ways. She's really thinking about what this process means in her hands. And one way that I think she really does this is through scale and through the use of the female figure. So Halfmoon talks about her work as inherently feminist, but also really incredibly personal to her experience of being in the world in her own body. She talks about, I can't remember if it was in your interview or a different interview I read, but she talks about the works being a celebration of the female body, but all bodies, all the curves, all the hips, and all the power that these bodies can carry. And she's also talked about ceramics as a way of painting in 3 dimensions. You can see that there's big loaded paintbrushes happening here, and she, like many studio art students, did start as a painter. And you can see that painterly approach in the glazes and in the patternings. The glaze drips, and it really sort of highlights these deep finger impressions, the drags that are so visible in the work. And they're really evidence of the physical effort that's important to Halfmoon. So the paintings on these sculptures are also laden with symbols, stars that recall both cardinal directions, but also are, again, sort of a imagining of new nations, new symbols of state, spirals, crosshatch, X's, among other symbols of Caddo culture, and they also reference the geography of Halfmoon's homeland. And I'll talk a little bit more in depth about bringing community into collaboration when I get to work that she and Cannupa Hanska Luger are doing together, but just to show you again this physical process and how it really makes collaboration inherent. So she has also spoken, I saw this on the label just today, about being influenced by other examples of really massive works that were made through collaboration. So the large stone moai from Rapa Nui, the Easter Island, the spiral mounds that are in present-day Oklahoma, and the colossal Olmec heads from ancient Mesoamerica. And the way that we know that these endeavors required people to work together to build them. And she has a real desire in her practice to have people help her. That's very exciting for her. But because she's working in this traditional Caddo style building process, which means that it's coil upon coil upon coil, and also because she's often working in residencies all over the country, there aren't like huge kilns just everywhere. So she travels to do a number of these works. It means that she's not often working with other Caddo makers. So she's teaching the people that are on her team or that are in these places, she's teaching them about the traditions, and she's also, undergoing cleansing rituals and creating a space of sensitivity and love and safety for these works and for their relationships with each other. So these are just a couple of images that I asked Raven to send me from the making of Flag Bearer, which she made at California State Long Beach because it has an 8-foot kiln, and a whole team came with her to build this coil by coil. It was made in separate pieces we were talking about earlier, dried separately and then fired separately, each piece for 3 weeks each. So it's not just the physical building, but also the attention that it takes to watch these things happen, make sure that they're safe. I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with Simone Leigh's work, her incredible Venice Biennale installation, which the subsequent show is traveling, I believe it's at the Hirshhorn now, large-scale projects in New York, in museum collections across the country, or world, really. And Leigh is an artist that Halfmoon has cited as an influence on her work. I think you can sort of see why, just by the types of works and imagery that she's approaching. But Leigh also locates much of her work and her interests, both materially and conceptually, in her own background, specifically as the daughter of Jamaican immigrants, in her position in the world as a Black woman, and also in her educational background in cultural studies and philosophy. And really importantly, part of the thinking is that Leigh has long participated in a network that builds on Black feminist traditions of community and communal exchange, and it's really important in the way that she makes and shares her works. And for Leigh, the clay itself materializes these conversations about labor and about place. The form that her ceramic vessels take evoke both this female figure and they evoke the traditions that these pots emerge from, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So in Leigh's work, the Black female body and architecture are really repositories for a lived experience. They're very present in both her ceramics and then also her large-scale works. Neither of these are actually ceramic in their final form, but I'll show you how they get there. And I think it's particularly interesting to think about how Leigh's and Halfmoon's bodies both are made from clay because this material is life-giving, because it is of the earth. And potter and ceramic scholar Sequoia Miller calls clay the primordial, preconscious earth. He says that the endurance of ceramics as both material and medium speak to how we as humans have long walked the earth. And I love to think about this quote and about how artists choose to use clay as a way of choosing to be an active and visible part of this continuum of human life. Miller also counts this, though, as one of the reasons why clay as a medium in sculpture has been sort of hindered or marginalized in the canon of fine art. So one of Leigh's greatest inspirations as an artist was seeing Nigerian water pots made by Ladi Kowali, an artist from the Gwari region. And Leigh said that discovering the beauty of the pot made her think about objects in a very particular way. She said that because she only had a philosophy and a cultural studies background, she started to think about the means of production, about the knowledge that was necessary to make these objects. And what she came to understand about them is that typically these water pots were made by women anonymously, mostly Black women in Africa, but there's a very similar tradition of ceramic production across the Caribbean and in Jamaica in particular. And Leigh said that even before she really considered being an artist, she was obsessed with making water pots in her spare time. She would make these giant terracotta pots in the basement of the ceramic store that she worked at in Greenwich Village. And she felt like it was sort of this perfect form. It was something that women had been making all over the world for centuries, and it had this anonymity to it. So thinking about anonymous labor and function began to inform the approach that she took in her work. She was working, this process piece or process image of the work that was on the High Line. She was working with folks at a place called the Stratton Sculpture Studio in Philadelphia to work on these sort of massive sculptures, as well as some for the Venice Biennale. And instead of using 3D printing or sort of stone sculpting, which has become very popular and maybe the way that most artists do really large-scale works, she and they chose the more old-fashioned way of making a clay model to eventually become the bronze work. So again, that physicality is really important from the beginning of the work. So of course, there's the need to work with others, to rely on others to make these. This is also the firing of much of her work. Even the smaller pots requires often up to 9 people to monitor the process in like shifts to watch it. And some of the spirit of collaboration is really captured in this film that she made with Madeline Hunt-Ehrlich. That was also on view in Venice, and gives really sort of insight into the labor of the practice, the sort of ecosystem that builds out of working with others, and all of the ways that different materials have to come in. Just briefly, organizing, communal sharing have always been a part of her practice, but she really, and often there have been projects that have had direct action as a part of them, organizing a Free People's Medical Clinic with creative time at the New Museum, organizing a social initiative to promote spiritual health, but it was really epitomized in a 3-day program in Venice that was part of her installation at the US Pavilion, where she brought together scholars, artists, and activists from around the world. It was centered on Black women's intellectual and creative labor, and was called Loophole of Retreat, this idea of thinking of spaces simultaneously enclosure, but also place for enacting ideas of freedom, of thinking and planning and imagining. So another artist that I actually don't know if Raven Halfmoon talks about that much, but whose ceramics are a really important part of his very multivalent practice is Theaster Gates, which you all might be familiar with. He works in so many mediums, performance, assemblage, public sculpture, but he also works across a lot of disciplines. He's an urban planner, an archivist, a social organizer, all while being an artist as well. So one thing that I found really compelling is the way that he actually talks about clay as an origin story, or an originating material that predates all of these other practices and materials. And what he said is that clay turned me on to the possibility of making and the evolutionary nature of making, which has allowed me to feel comfortable exploring other materials, ideas, and conceptual tropes. Clay made me and is forever the root of my artistic interests, but I don't feel limited by any origin story to work solely within the confines of my origin. Blackness, clay, immateriality, and space are all launching pads that encourage advanced practice, reflection, trial, and iteration. I am practicing acts of creation. So this importance of clay's connection to earth and to history that is echoed in his relationship to the material, I think is a way that he's sort of channeling the earth and bringing that into the work. And beyond that, Gates has also said that clay can be both instructive and comparative for him. It's a way to think about history and a way to think about culture. So this is an installation, Black Vessel, that comprised 40,000 clay bricks that he made. It was this truly immersive and experiential space that was created within the white box of the Gagosian Gallery just a couple of years ago. And for Gates, there are also a few nodes of understanding that underpin his use of clay. First, as I mentioned, his understanding of clay as a means to understand oneself. Second is his history of study in Japan and what that introduction of ceramics meant to him. Sorry. And third, where his research more recently led him, specifically research about David Drake, or Dave the Potter. So Gates studied in Tokonami, Japan, when he was in college, or just after college, which is known for a particular, I think I'm going to work through this, particular version of terracotta, and for a particular skill in the area. So he describes encountering this skill in Tokonami as this real humility pill, but it also is a place when compared to, other Japanese traditional craft, is less hermetic and more open to experimentation. And one of the most important lessons that he sort of was presented with there was when he was asked by this master potter, Santo-san Sugiya Sato, Why are you here making a Japanese bowl? Your family's from Mississippi. Why aren't you making a Mississippi bowl? And Gates took this as sort of a confrontation with his own otherness, but a confrontation in a way that made his otherness feel great, that encouraged him to learn from it and lean into it. And so eventually out of this experience, Gates created this term Afro-Minge. And sorry, Minge was a movement, meaning arts of the people. A movement started in the 1920s in Japan. That was really about a desire to hold on to traditions, to slow down modernization, and to acknowledge a commitment to craft. And so for Gates, the history of Minge, or this movement in the 20s, really related to the idea of a Black is beautiful movement and an appreciation for craft and how knowledge is handed down. So Afro-Minge for Gates is a real fusion between the Black experience and the folk art and craft of Japan, and these ideas about sort of leaning into tradition and appreciation for craft. And then the other research project that Gates has undertaken that's had a big impact on his work is into the history of David Drake, and that's what the example on the right there is, or on the left. David Drake was an artist who was born into slavery around the turn of the 19th century. He labored in South Carolina. And in South Carolina in 1834, a law was in place which outlawed enslaved people from learning how to read or write. So David Drake was making these pots where he was not only signing his name, but he was also writing poetry and inscribing these into these pots. A real act of sort of defiance and through beauty. And Gates says that before he really understood Drake's work, he himself felt invisible in the history of this material, and that he really felt through this research that he needed this lineage to be acknowledged for himself. He needed to name the history of this work and this material, and as he said, he needed Dave to have the right to be a potter. And of course, giving Dave the right to be a potter gave Gates the right to be a potter as well. He also takes a very multifaceted approach to collaboration. There are many projects. I worked with him many, many years ago in one of his first sort of social practice projects in the 2010 biennial at the old Whitney. Working with the Black monks has been a through line of his artistic practice, working with music, again, working in community with the Rebuild Foundation on the south side of Chicago to provide free arts programming, new amenities for artists, this incredible library. So Rose B. Simpson is an artist that I hope you all are familiar with. If you come to the Whitney before the end of February, you can see this work as well. And it was interesting to see the way that both Theaster and Rose talk about their relationship to clay. So what Rose says is, I think in clay. Clay was the earth that grew our food, was the house we lived in, was the pottery we ate out of and prayed with. So my relationship to clay is ancestral, and I think it has a deep genetic memory. It's like a family member for us. So Simpson's artistic impulses came naturally and very early, and I'll mention this in a moment, but she's part of a really long line of Capao Owingen or Santa Clara Pueblo artists. And making and creating has definitely always been more than just a vocation for her and her family. Beyond working with clay, Simpson's practice includes metal and printmaking and painting and performance and cars. But she said that her turning point to understanding her own individual ceramic process came during a school trip to Kashihara, Japan, and that when she encountered this Japanese aesthetic tradition that really prizes the acceptance of the process over the perfection of the form, it helped her think more seriously about her own Pueblo's creative legacy, and her own being in Japan felt to her like she was dropped into a world which that I was completely incapable of communicating, which for me was not unlike the Western art world. At this point, she said, I realized that my artwork had to become more specific and more clear. So these images are from an installation that just ended earlier this year in rural Massachusetts, in which she made a dozen of these figures, which she refers to as ancestors or ancestor beings, and they're watching over the landscape here. In this installation, they're in these really verdant fields, but works from this project are also currently at the Whitney on one of our terraces, overlooking a very different landscape, the city, but also the Hudson River. And these particular figures are actually made out of dyed concrete and steel. But an important part of the project are also the adornments on these ancestor beings. And she worked with the Stockbridge-Munsee community band of Mohican Indians on whose ancestral lands this field form sits. She invited these folks from the community. They're now based in Wisconsin after decades of removal from this land. And she invited them to make beaded necklaces out of the clay from their current homelands to adorn these sculpted bodies. So she made these ancestor beings as a means of putting this process out into the world, putting these beings in a place where they can watch over and sort of continue the process of being made, being part of the landscape. And importantly, the eyes on these figures are hollow. They go through the sculpture, they let the light through, and they also sort of suggest an awareness of the world beyond our present reality, pointing out to landscapes not seen from here. And Simpson has really developed her own relationship to clay. I think each of these artists has very different ways of working with the material. She calls this a slab process to make these really thin sheets. I think it really is literally, she slaps them on these slabs of clay on the ground until they're incredibly thin. And she says that using these thin sheets forces her to be really present because the material is particularly sensitive and could break. And similarly to the way that Halfmoon describes her process, Simpson does not feel the need to hide the process, to hide the fingerprints or the indentations or the scratch marks. These marks actually reveal the truth and the history that's in the process through the material. And in fact, what she says is that the making that is our greatness, seeing our ancestors' hands feels important. It relates to place and to history. So she's putting herself sort of in this position as, in some ways, a future ancestor as well. These human-like figures are also, they're projects of empowerment. Many of them refer to sort of warriors in different ways. And she's interested in using her art to transform a victim narrative for herself and her community. I briefly mentioned she's part of this long lineage of artists, and particularly ceramic artists. Her work is really about intergenerational knowledge, about how we learn from those that are in our life. And Simpson says that she was given clay through her mom, Roseanne Swensel, this far right here, that it was passed down to her and that they make and they build conversations together. But clay was passed down to her mother as well. Rose's great-grandmother was Rose Naranjo, and her great-aunts, Nora Naranjo Morris. She's also worked more collaboratively with relatives like Eliza Naranjo Morse and Nora here too in a site Santa Fe work where they were really using adobe, so a building material, to create this line connecting indoor and outdoor space around Santa Fe. So there's really these psychological links often between the objects that they're making and collaborating in. Just one more slide looking closely at her relationship with her mother, Roseanne, who she collaborates with not only to make objects, there's a detail of this here, which is a work that they were commissioned to make for the Hood Museum at Dartmouth that really looks at connections with motherhood and womanhood across sort of time and space, but also in building homes in the Pueblo and building spaces for their family to be together. And she's really interested in these types of collaboration because she says there's no separation between art and life for her. When you're uncomfortable in any one place, there's a tremendous opportunity for investigation. And I think there's also a tremendous opportunity for imagining new futures in this way of working and thinking of intergenerational knowledge. So the last artist I'm going to talk about, now that I get my voice back, is just a couple of projects, or look at a couple of projects that the artist Cannupa Hanska Luger has been working on. He has also a very vast sort of career and really varied way of working if you know his practice at all, and he's been included in a number of exhibitions over the last, I would say, 5 or 10 years, so has been much more visible, particularly in New York, but he's truly multidisciplinary and works in film, performance, painting, sculpture, as well as activism, which is a really big part of his practice. But underlying all the aspects of his practice are a focus on Indigenous futures, and he uses the term Indigenous futurism to describe his work and his way of thinking. how to form futures, what they can look like, how the past informs them. So just a couple of projects. This one is called Everyone. And it came through a social collaboration project that Luger launched in 2018 called MMIWQT BEAD Project, which stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, Queer, and Trans Relatives. And he's really thinking about the lack of information around violence towards women, particularly Indigenous women, and in particular, thinking about the lack of data. So there was a 2008 report from the US Department of Justice that noted that Indigenous women are murdered at 10 times the national average on many reservations across the US, but that's really old data, and he was interested in launching a project that would help support exposure for missing and murdered Indigenous women, but also highlight the lack of data and sort of push for more understanding. So this is a work that was made of over 4,000 individual handmade clay beads. They were created by hundreds of communities across present-day US and Canada, and each of the beads symbolizes a relative, a person that was lost through violence. And the goal was really to rehumanize this data of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. The image is by a photographer named Kaylee Spitzer called Sister. And there was a real call for community organization that were also a video on social media, sort of giving explanations so people could do this in the sort of privacy of their own home as well, because it was also, a healing process for many people. Here you can see the community action at a few different museums, the Museum of Indian Art and Culture. And the process of making this work and acknowledging and bringing attention to this violent past and present was to offer a path for an alternative future. So the work itself traveled to museums all over the US and Canada. It continues to travel and actually raise money for funds, the Indigenous community organizers, as well as sort of data funds. So thinking about clay as holding not just the memory of the earth and not just being a material related to humankind, but also as a body itself that holds memory. This project, of course, is made up of thousands of individual memories and individual absences. So one of the questions that Luger is really asking himself is how we might sculpt vessels to hold the future. And one way he thinks about it is looking at the work of his own ancestors. Luger's an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes of Fort Berthold Reservation, which is Mandan, Hidatsu, and Arika, and he's also Lakota. So he's been investigating Mandan ancestral ways in particular of making clay. And this exhibition was an exhibition, Mahapmuk, which was in Asheville, North Carolina. It's part of an ongoing research project to recover the Mandan clay traditions. The exhibition title translates from Mandan language to nowadays, in modern times, and here we are. And he's really using this title as a declaration of presence and of resilience and thinking about how this research is sort of moving forward. And he's been conducting research at Fort Berthold Reservation to relearn this process. It also means that he's digging and processing and testing and firing and observing. And he says, through doing all of this, I've only just begun to understand the complex ancestral technologies. And yet a memory has been woken in my muscles. I'm at the beginning, honoring the knowledge of before, the experimentation of the present, and practicing a way forward for future generations. No, these are just examples of his individual works. Many of these become sort of props and videos and performances that he does as well. Public art has been a really big part of his practice, in particular in important sites of history. So this is at the University of Michigan's Art and Museum of Art. He painted the words gift in sort of slap, basically, and in clay on the columns, really an intervention or a response to the University of Michigan's origin story, its stewardship or maybe lack of stewardship of the land that it occupies, which was allegedly gifted to the university by the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi tribes, but then it was sold to found their endowments. So this work is time-based. It will sort of reveal itself over the course of time that it is on the columns of the museum. And then I wanted to end here, taking you on quite a journey, to bring all of these really sort of broad ideas of artistic practices, these big ideas of history and cultural connection, the ways that artists are engaging with community and collaboration. I want to bring it back to a project that Raven and Cannupa are working on together. They've just embarked on that directly relates to the way that each of these artists, but really everyone that we were talking about tonight, approaches the histories of clay and ceramics as potentials for forward-looking, for imagining futures. And Halfmoon was the first Indigenous resident at the Archie Bray Center in Helena, Montana, when she started going there in 2019. She's returned every year. Theaster Gates was also a resident in 2021. It's where he created some of his large-scale ceramics and began working on a film project. And Luger also began going in 2021. And each of these artists have been really involved in widening the perspectives of this program in rural Montana, bringing in more Indigenous artists, more artists of color to the residencies, but in particular, the work that Raven and Cannupa have been doing around initiating this first fire, which was conceptualized by Raven and Cannupa in 2020 as this ongoing Indigenous-centered educational and research-based program. They have the long-term goal of constructing a permanent pit firing site at the Archie Bray, and their conception is that this new site will be a dedicated gathering space for Indigenous pit firing practitioners to share knowledge, to host Indigenous-led educational programming, around really global clay practices. So neither of these artists know where this project will go, but they can imagine many potentialities sort of coming out of this, and worked with many of the artists that they had invited to be residents at Archie Bray as well. And I wanted to end with this because I think it points to really strongly to the importance of history, the cultural connections that are made through clay, through ceramics, but also the collaborative possibilities, and most importantly, that it's looking towards the future. So, thank you all.
Thank you so much.